بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. Over the last few weeks we have been speaking about the events that took place in Palestine in the early 2000s. Now, tonight, inshallah, we want to talk about the events, the tragic events of the early morning of March 22nd, 2004. March 22nd, 2004. So it was just before sunrise in Gaza city. And Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, he had just finished praying Salatul Fajr in the local masjid that was near his home. And in previous lessons we talked about Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. He was a quadriplegic sheikh, but he was a very important figure in the resistance against the occupation. So he was paralyzed from the neck down. So he was in a wheelchair and he was taken to the masjid for Salatul Fajr, where he would pray in the masjid near his home. And then after Salatul Fajr, he was being wheeled out by his aides, by his assistants. So they were taking him out of the masjid on his wheelchair and going towards the van that was waiting, that they would put him in that van, and that van would take him back home. So this was his daily routine in the mornings. He would pray Salatul Fajr in the masjid, then his aides would take him out on his wheelchair, put him in the van, and the van would take him home. But this morning, the morning of March 22nd, 2004, he prayed Salatul Fajr, and as he was coming out of the masjid, an Israeli Apache helicopter fired 3 Hellfire missiles directly at him. So these blasts tore throughout the streets, and Sheikh Ahmed Yassin rahimahullah was killed instantly, along with 7 others, including his 2 bodyguards and a lot of others from the Musallin who had just prayed Salatul Fajr in the masjid. So the eyewitnesses who witnessed it from afar, they said that his body was thrown from his wheelchair, right? And he was killed instantly, rahimahullah. So within minutes after this attack, the alleys around Gaza erupted in cries and sirens, and people ran into the streets and they were shouting, Allahu Akbar. People were extremely saddened. This was a very, very important figure in the history of the resistance against the Zionist occupation for decades. So the Israeli government assassinated him with a targeted assassination. Can you imagine this? A man on a wheelchair. And the Israeli government felt so threatened by him that they sent an Apache helicopter to fire 3 missiles at him. A quadriplegic in his wheelchair coming out of the masjid. Right? That's how much they feared this man. So, of course, the people were very saddened. He was a very important figure in the resistance. They were sad, but they were also very angry. They were filled with rage. Right? So, Gaza went into a state of mourning after the assassination of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. And hundreds of thousands of people gathered for the janazah of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. And this was actually, to this day, this was one of the largest, if not the largest, funeral in the history of Palestine. The funeral of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, rahimahullah. So of course, his janazah was taken through the streets of Gaza when they were taking it to the graveyard, surrounded by men, right? Everyone wanted to have a chance to carry it. Right? And they were saying, as they were carrying his body to the graveyard, they were shouting out, Kulluna Ahmad Yasin. Kulluna Ahmad Yasin. All of us are Sheikh Ahmad Yasin. We are all Sheikh Ahmad Yasin. Right? So this was an incident or an event that caused great sadness in the hearts of the Palestinian people, and especially the people of Gaza. And it also filled them with anger that the Israeli government would target a quadriplegic in his wheelchair coming out of the masjid. So the prime minister of Israel at the time was Ariel Sharon, la'natullahi alayh, Ariel Sharon. And after the assassination of Sheikh Ahmad Yasin, Ariel Sharon publicly bragged and boasted. He said, "We have eliminated the head of the snake." This was his statement. "We have eliminated the head of the snake." But actually, what he did was inflame the resistance. Instead of cutting off the head of the resistance, he made the resistance even more severe, because they were angry now and they wanted revenge. So within hours, the resistance vowed that they would take revenge for what the Israeli government did to Sheikh Ahmad Yasin. Right? So many of these resistance movements, they joined together in solidarity, right? And they said that they would avenge the death of Sheikh Ahmad Yasin. So the streets of Palestine, from Gaza to Nablus to Khalil, all over the place, not only Gaza itself, but even outside of Gaza, the streets of Palestine, and even outside of Palestine, in other places in the Arab world, in Cairo, Egypt, in Amman, Jordan, in Damascus, in Syria, right? There were crowds that came into the streets to condemn the assassination of Sheikh Ahmad Yasin, rahimahullah. And even some of the Western pundits and analysts, right? You know, those analysts who come on TV and they discuss the situation. Some of them even said that killing Sheikh Ahmad Yasin, the killing of Sheikh Ahmad Yasin may bring some short-term satisfaction to Israel, but in the long run, it will strengthen the movement that Sheikh Ahmad Yasin built, right? It will make that resistance movement even stronger, right? And this is exactly what happened. The resistance became stronger after the assassination of Sheikh Ahmad Yasin. So the assassination of Sheikh Ahmad Yasin, it really marked a turning point. And it exposed the willingness of the Israeli government to use war machines against unarmed civilians. They actually sent an Apache helicopter and fired 3 Hellfire missiles. This is very advanced weapons, right? Very advanced weaponry that they used against a disabled Muslim on his wheelchair coming out of the masjid after the prayer, right? So of course, Sheikh Ahmad Yasin, after this, he was already very well respected by the people, but after his assassination, he became a legend. He became a legend, right? And he was actually a representation of the unbreakable spirit of the people of Palestine. And from the statements of Sheikh Ahmad Yasin, he was a preacher, right? He was a sheikh, he was an imam. So he would say, we seek shahada, we seek martyrdom in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not because we love death, but because we fight for life under the shade of freedom. We want a dignified life. We want a dignified life. So we will fight in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if we get martyrdom, alhamdulillah. So we seek either shahada or victory. Right? And both of these are a victory. Victory is a victory, and shahada, fighting in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and dying in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is also a victory. Right? So the Israeli government may have destroyed his body, but they did not destroy his movement, his ideas. And they were not able to shake the faith of the Palestinian people. Walhamdulillah. So just think about this, and think of how it looked to the world. The Sheikh He's a quadriplegic. He can't move his arms or his legs. He's confined to a wheelchair. He had no weapons, right? But still, Israel feared him. They feared this man more than they feared armies, right? So it just goes to show the mindset of these people. So Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, he was a person who embodied the steadfastness of the Palestinian people, right? And after he was assassinated, this made the resistance all the more stronger. Now, a couple of years later, in early 2006, the Palestinians were going to the polls in an election to choose a new parliament, to choose the Palestinian Legislative Council. Remember, the Palestinian Authority, they called themselves a democracy where members of the Legislative Council would be elected. So they held elections in early 2006. So the elections actually took place on January 25th, 2006. Right? So the Palestinian people were very excited about this. Right? People in Gaza, people in the West Bank, there were long lines, people wanting to vote. And it was clear that they wanted change. They were sick about the false promises in the so-called peace process, the diplomacy that was never working for decades. They were tired of all of this and they wanted a big change. They wanted a big change. And it became very evident that they wanted a big change when Hamas actually won the majority of the seats in that election. The majority of the seats for the Palestinian Legislative Council were won by Hamas. Hamas, they took place in these elections and they had the biggest victory. So this was a clear sign that the Palestinian people, they were not happy with how things had been going for the last so many years or for the last so many decades. They were sick of the Palestinian Authority and the politicians of the Palestinian Authority, the politicians of Al-Fath. They were tired of this and they wanted something new. So Hamas actually won the majority of the seats in the 2006 election. And Hamas, it's not just a military movement. Hamas was a grassroots movement that had built schools, they had built clinics, they had built welfare offices, right? Throughout the decades, these are the things that they had done. Hamas was founded in 1987, and Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was actually one of the founders of Hamas. And they used to build schools and charity organizations and hospitals, and they would do all of these things. So the first thought that comes to people's mind is, okay, it's a military movement. That's part of it, but it also had these other branches as well. So the people of Palestine, the people of Palestine, they saw this and they voted for Hamas. And Hamas was able to win the majority of the seats in this election. So there were 132 seats that were being contested in this election. And Hamas won 74 out of 132. They won 74 out of the 132 seats. So they got the parliamentary majority. And Al-Fath, that was the long dominant party, the party of Yasser Arafat. And after Yasser Arafat, the party of Mahmoud Abbas. Right? That party only took 45 seats. They only won 45 seats. Right? So the United States and Europe and the Western world is always calling for democracy, democracy, let the people choose, right? So this was a democratic election and Hamas won. But do you think the United States was happy with this? Okay, it was a democratic election. We always call for democracy. We want democracy, let the people choose. But they only want the people to choose the people that they want in charge. The United States, when they say we support democracy, they don't mean that. They mean that we want democracy, but only if you're going to vote for the person that we want to win. Then we like democracy. But if you're going to vote for someone else, then no, this is not acceptable. So this was proven when Hamas won the parliamentary elections. What happened? What did the United States do? The United States and Israel and the European Union, they froze all funds to the new government. And they demanded that Hamas must recognize Israel. And Hamas must renounce the resistance. And they must accept all of the previous agreements. These previous peace treaties that had been made over the years, Hamas has to accept all of that. But of course, Hamas refused. They refused to surrender their principles. So, the world, led by the United States and Israel and the European Union, they responded with sanctions on Palestine, and Israel actually put a siege upon Gaza. So Palestinian tax revenues were withheld after the election of Hamas. Aid was cut, salaries went unpaid, right? These are economic punishments. So the United States, which likes to say that they want democracy everywhere, right? If the Palestinians choose who they want in democracy, then no, that's not acceptable. That is considered a crime, right? So it just shows the hypocrisy of the Western world when they talk big about democracy, 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 right? It's all a big game. This is the reality of the situation, right? Then, in June of 2006, so a few months after this election, the tension became even more intense. So there was a cross-border raid, and there was an Israeli soldier named Gilad Shalit, and he was captured by the Palestinians. So the Israelis, they launched a military operation that was known as Operation Summer Rains, and that was an assault that crippled the already fragile infrastructure of Gaza. So power stations in Gaza were bombed, bridges in Gaza were destroyed, and complete neighborhoods in Gaza were flattened. Right? This was June of 2006. A few months later, in November of that same year, Beit Hanun also became a point where the Israelis destroyed so much of the city. Right? There was an Israeli shelling in Beit Hanun which killed 19 innocent civilians as they slept. Innocent civilians. They target innocent civilians. And we know this. We all know this by now. That the Israeli military, they target innocent civilians, including women and children. Right? So they killed in Beit Hanun 19 civilians as they slept. And, mothers were shown weeping over the bodies of their children. And their homes had turned into dust. So this was the massacre at Beit Hanun in November of 2006. So by the end of 2006, by the end of the year, it was clear. This was not about politics, right? It was about punishment. The Israel and the United States wanted to punish the Palestinian people for electing Hamas. That's what it all was about, right? So the big talk about democracy, it was proven to be just lip service. They don't want democracy. They just want you to be ruled by the ones that they approve of. And that's it. All right. Now, 2006 ended. 2007 started. By mid-2007, by the middle of 2007, internal tensions between Hamas and Al-Fath. Al-Fath, that was the party of Mahmoud Abbas, right? So Al-Fath and Hamas, they had tensions with each other. Hamas had won the majority of the seats, and Al-Fath won a decent amount of seats as well. But now there was a lot of internal tension between Hamas and Al-Fath because they had very different ideologies. So by mid-2007, these tensions between Hamas and Al-Fath, they reached their peak. And there were weeks of bloody clashes. And at the end, Hamas was able to take full control of Gaza. Hamas then took full control of Gaza under the leadership of Ismail Haniyeh. While the PA, the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas, they consolidated their power in the West Bank, right? So the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas, they are in control of the west of the Palestinian areas of the West Bank, and Hamas under Ismail Haniyeh, they took control of Gaza. So it's one nation, the Palestinian people, but look, they are split into two now. Hamas controlling Gaza and the PA controlling the Palestinian parts of the West Bank. So this was an internal division within the Palestinian people. So once Hamas took full control of Gaza, then Israel declared Gaza as a hostile entity. And they imposed a full land, sea, and air blockade. So it was a siege on Gaza, and they tightened it like a noose around their necks, right? So only a very small trickle of goods was allowed into Gaza, just enough to keep the population alive, just enough to barely keep them alive, right? Export was banned. Fishing zones were restricted. Students lost their scholarships. Students who were studying abroad, now they can't leave Gaza. They were stuck inside Gaza. They couldn't leave, right? So they lost their scholarships. Parents were separated from their children. If there were some families where some members of the family lived in Gaza and other members of the family lived in other parts of Palestine, they were separated. There was no way for them to meet anymore. Patients died waiting for medical permits. If there was someone with a medical condition in Gaza and they needed advanced treatment that they couldn't get in the hospitals of Gaza, they needed a special medical permit to leave Gaza, even for treatment. And these permits would take a very long time to come, if they would ever come. So many patients died. They died in Gaza waiting for the medical permits, right? So look at the brutality of the occupation. So by the end of that year, by the end of 2007, of course, with all of these restrictions, Gaza's economy completely collapsed, and its people were basically trapped behind concrete and barbed wire. So that's why they call Gaza an open-air prison. An open-air prison, because that's really what it is. All right, so then in November of 2007, representatives from around the world gathered in Annapolis, Maryland, here in the United States. So there was a conference. It's known as the Annapolis Conference because it took place in Annapolis, Maryland. And that conference was hosted by then U.S. President George W. Bush, along with the Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert. And also present was the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. And there were also foreign ministers from many other nations. But the elected government of Gaza, Hamas, no representative from Hamas was there. Ismail Haniyeh or anyone. No one was invited to that conference from Hamas. Right? So again, it just shows that the US, they don't care about democracy. They just want to install into power whomever they approve of. That's what it is. Right? So the stated goal of the Annapolis Conference was to, quote unquote, revive the peace process that had stalled, right? And to achieve a two-state solution by the end of 2008. Those were the stated goals. But it was all just a big show. It was pageantry, right? That's all it was. It was all just a big show, and nothing really came out of it. So the leaders, they exchanged handshakes, they shook each other's hands, they talked about peace, right? But the reality is, while these people were meeting in Annapolis, what was going on in Palestine, the Israeli government was actually accelerating settlement construction in the West Bank. They were building more settlements, stealing more land. While the Prime Minister of Israel was sitting in Maryland talking about peace, how he wants peace, his people back home were actually stealing more Palestinian land at the same time. Look at the hypocrisy. of these people. So they accelerated the settlement construction in the West Bank. They continued raids in Nablus and Jenin and other places. And they tightened even more the blockade around Gaza. So they're talking about peace, but their actions are showing the complete opposite of their words, right? So for Palestinians, the conference at Annapolis, it came to symbolize really the hypocrisy of diplomacy. That this diplomacy that had been going on for so many decades, it's all just a show of hypocrisy. That's all it ever was, and that's all it ever has been. And it continues to be that today, right? So this conference, in the eyes of the world, this conference gave Israel international legitimacy. Like, oh, look, they really are trying to find a solution, right? They really are sitting at the table negotiating, trying to find a solution. So it gave them some international legitimacy in the eyes of the people, right? And it also gave the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, it gave them a photo opportunity as well, right? Like, yeah, they're trying to find a solution as well that everyone will be happy with, right? But as for Gaza, it gave Gaza nothing at all. No freedom, no electricity, no food, no bread, nothing. Didn't help them in the least, right? Just a big show. All right. In 2008, around the middle of 2008, after months of bombardment and rocket fire, both sides, they sought a reprieve. They wanted a ceasefire. Hamas in Gaza and the Israeli government, they wanted a ceasefire, right? So Egypt got involved. This is mid-2008. Egypt got involved and they brokered what became known as the Hudna, al-Hudna, meaning a temporary truce, like a ceasefire, starting in June of 2008. That this Hudna will be effective in June of 2008. And the terms of this Hudna, of this temporary truce, were straightforward. Like Hamas would halt their rocket fire, they would stop firing rockets, and Israel would ease the blockade. The blockade of Gaza would be eased by Israel, and they would stop their attacks as well. So for a few months, it seemed to be working. The rocket fire from Hamas, it mostly stopped. And for the first time in a long while, the skies of Gaza were quiet. The skies of Gaza were quiet for a while. But as for Israel, they never fulfilled their part. They did not ease the blockade at all. Right? Rather, the blockade remained suffocating, and the crossing stayed closed. And the humanitarian conditions within Gaza actually became even worse during this period. Then on November 4th, 2008, Israeli forces actually entered Gaza. They actually came into Gaza and they killed 6 Hamas fighters. And this was a direct violation of the truce. So the Hudna, this temporary truce, it collapsed. It collapsed, right? And the situation continued to get worse. On December 27th, 2008, it was a Saturday morning, right? Children were leaving their schools. Saturday was a school day, right? They're in Palestine. So the children were leaving their schools, the streets were busy, right? And at exactly 11:30 a.m. on December 27th, 2008, Israeli warplanes struck in waves. And this was an operation that was called Operation Cast Lead. And the Palestinians actually call it the Gaza Massacre. The Gaza Massacre. So 11:30 a.m. on a Saturday morning, within a few minutes, these Israeli warplanes killed more than 100 people. And they continued shooting throughout the day, and by nightfall, more than 200 people had been killed. Israel, the official story of the Israeli government is that they were targeting militants. But that's not the truth. The reality is that they engulfed all of Gaza, and this continued not for just days, it continued for 3 weeks, for 22 straight days, right? And during these 22 days, 1,400 Palestinian civilians were killed, including over 300 children. 5,000 more were wounded. Masajid, hospitals, schools, police stations, you name it, they were all destroyed. And the Israeli military was using white phosphorus as a weapon. They were using white phosphorus. And this is actually illegal to use, right? By international law, it's considered illegal to use, but they used it anyways, and it rained down on the civilian neighborhoods, burning through rooftops, right? Innocent civilians just minding their own business, sitting in their homes, and this white phosphorus comes onto their roofs, and it dissolves their roofs and comes into the homes. This is the barbaric nature of the Israeli military. So this white phosphorus basically was raining down upon Gaza, burning through rooftops and burning through the flesh of innocent civilians, including women and children. They struck ambulances, they struck medical convoys. They didn't care about any of these things. Entire neighborhoods, like the neighborhood of Az-Zaytun and the neighborhood of Khuza'a, right? They were basically wiped off the map, right? And the people of Gaza, the innocent civilians of Gaza, where could they run? They couldn't run anywhere. The borders were sealed. The borders were completely sealed. The sea was patrolled. They couldn't even go into the sea, right? So they were stuck. So families, they tried to huddle in masajid, in schools, right? That's the best that they could do. That was the situation. That was the situation towards the end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009. So when this bombardment finally ended in January of 2009, after 22 straight days, when it finally ended in January of 2009, Gaza was unrecognizable. It was unrecognizable. And tens of thousands of the people of Gaza became homeless. And the soil, the land, the soil of Gaza was poisoned with this white phosphorus. It was poisoned, right? And the hospitals were overflowing with those who were wounded. That was the situation. And Israel had the nerve to call this operation a success. They said, yes, this operation Cast Lead, it was a success. But the Palestinians, they called it what it actually was, a massacre. It's known as the Gaza Massacre. So that took place from December 2008 to January of 2009, right? So these were the events that took place during that period of time, up to early 2009. And inshallah, we'll stop there for today, bi'idhnillah. And inshallah, in our next session, we will continue with the history of the Holy Land, bi'idhnillah. Jazakumullahu khayra wa barakallahu feekum. Wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.